I'd like to introduce myself, first of all. My name is Jonathan Bowdler. I'm the head of regulatory compliance at International Compliance Training. I think it's a little bit unfair that I haven't been introduced by someone else and therefore have not had a round of applause, so if you don't mind. Thank you very much. Okay, for the next 30 minutes or so, my job now is obviously to follow in Lee's footsteps and talk to you a little bit about the governance, risk and compliance qualifications. First of all, just let's get this nice and clear. With your little forms in front of you, you will have seen the different levels. The first two levels, the certificate and the advanced certificate, are in compliance. The third and fourth level, the diploma and the professional postgraduate diploma, are in governance, risk and compliance. Now, that doesn't mean we don't talk about governance and risk when we're doing the compliance qualifications. It's a reflection of the importance of risk management and the importance of corporate governance. The more senior you become and the more detailed the qualifications become. So that's just that out of the way initially. First slide I've got on here refers to our lovely recent Brexit vote. And the reason that's number one slide is just to bring home the fact that if you work in the area of regulatory compliance, you are a change manager. You cannot escape that fact. In fact, if there wasn't regulatory change, after a little while of getting systems and controls in place to deal with the existing environment, you would, in fact, be out of a job. It's change and developments that continue our role going forward, and this is why our roles do change so often. Our job titles change probably annually. Our actual roles might change within every couple of years. And it's change and what that change represents in terms of challenges and opportunities for your business that the compliance qualifications look at. So, why is it such an exciting time in governance, risk and compliance? I'm not ashamed to say I'm excited about compliance, although I am usually a bit careful about what the audience is when I'm saying it. I can say it to you guys because you obviously have an interest. If you say it when you're with your friends who might be plumbers and footballers and other things, then it might sound a little bit sad. But I love compliance and regulatory change because it gives us an opportunity to actually improve the behaviour of the organisations we work with, to deal with previous mistakes, and actually, if we get it right, give our organisations some form of competitive advantage. Compliance is not just about complying with rules. Compliance is about helping your organisation be successful in a heavily regulated industry. So the role of the compliance professional over the last 20 years has changed considerably from being that person who is an expert on the legislation and can tell the firm what they are supposed to do and what they can't do, to now being a trusted advisor. Somebody who can help the business achieve its objectives despite the fact that the business may be pushing back and may consider regulation as getting in their way. When I started in compliance in 2001, I was immediately christened the Business Prevention Unit, and I could understand why, particularly now when I look back on it. But even though that was 15 years ago, I know that many people doing our courses still find themselves in that position, particularly in a firm that is newly regulated. Because if you haven't been regulated in the past, most people outside of our area see regulation as getting in the way. So another key element of the role of a compliance professional is to educate. And you can't educate unless you know what you're talking about. So you also have to be an expert in your area. So the developments we've been seeing recently are these changes to the regulatory environment. And it's not just legislation and regulation that changes. It's the approach to it that changes. It's how important it is to the economy, where it stands on the political agenda. We have a change of government, and we have a change in the way in which we're regulated. We even have changes in just sort of ministers and prime ministers and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and we see that the head of the regulators get new instructions. They're asked to behave in different ways. And all of this affects the regulatory environment within which your firm is working. So whilst our qualifications do look at the legislation and the regulation, the key elements, the things that are most important, a lot of the compliance qualifications are also then focusing on understanding how we influence those we work with. The best compliance professionals are the best communicators. The people who can take that knowledge, which is important, but then translate it in such a way that you demonstrate the benefits of what you're doing to your organization. And it's nearly always because there has been change of some kind. One of the key changes we have seen, which began post-credit crisis, but certainly was massively picked up when we moved into the area of the Financial Conduct Authority and the Prudential Regulatory Authority, was this focus on behaviour. First question to the audience. Who can tell me what the name is of the main financial services regulator in the UK today? Just shout it out. You're all wrong. When you say FCA, you're telling me 3 letters. That is not their name. What's their name? And what's the important word? Conduct. What is the best simile for conduct? The clue is in their title. Okay? They're not hanging about. We are the Financial Conduct Authority. This is how we expect you to behave. Yes, there's thousands of detailed rules. How many principles are there? Well done. One strong voice. Can you tell me what they are? No, that would be a bit cruel. Okay? Did you know every single enforcement case since 2006 has had a principle breach? Every one. Forget all the rules. Just comply with the principles. You will not go into enforcement. Don't do that. But what it does is it gives us a focus on it's about the principles. And again, the way in which regulation is changing is focusing on these very broad rules. That's all a principle is, a broad rule. You will act with integrity. You will treat your customers fairly. You will be open and honest in your communications. So the nature of what we do, the focus on behaviour, is significant. We've also got to think about, therefore, the impact this has upon us. When I started, back in 2001 again, we were sat in a little office on the 3rd floor of a building, and if I wanted to, I could spend all day in there, writing policies, checking things off, signing things off, and then just tootle off home without seeing any of my colleagues in the business. Nowadays, you are expected to walk the floor. You are expected to attend all relevant meetings. You are expected to put yourself forward, and you expect others to ask you for your advice and your guidance. You have to be part of the business's management, and you have to contribute to the success of the business. You don't work for the regulator. You are working for your firm, albeit your particular role is to make sure they do not fall foul of the regulatory environment. The role of the compliance officer themselves has changed massively. So far this morning, I've had perhaps about a dozen one-to-one conversations, and actually about 8 of those people have been lawyers, qualified lawyers, looking at potentially what you would consider maybe a sideways move into a compliance-type role is. And I've been honest with them. My workshop number 1, when I stand up in front of a new group of people, I'll ask them, put your hand up if you're a lawyer. So how many people here are qualified lawyers? Hands up. Come on, don't be shy. Right, lawyers make crack compliance officers. The exceptions being those who do ICA qualifications, because most don't. Knowing the difference between being a lawyer and a legal advisor and a compliance officer is critical. Compliance is a very pragmatic, people-focused role. It's about influencing people. It's about understanding people's motivations. It's about finding solutions. Of course you need legal brains in compliance functions, but you also need to think like a salesperson. You need to think like an operational person, like a marketing person. And again, this is one of the joys of working in compliance. You get that huge oversight of the entire business. You can go and find out about anything you want to, because pretty much everything in your firm is regulated in some way or other. So therefore, you can make a real contribution. And it's really important that the head of compliance has access to senior management, ideally reporting straight through to the board. And then finally, of course, the career structure. The reason we have a certificate at entry level and a postgraduate diploma at master's level is that the role of a compliance professional can go all the way from entry all the way through to the board. So it is now a real career structure. And having worked in compliance myself for 15 years and with ICT for the last 8, I can safely say the quality of the delegates has increased over the years, year on year on year, as more talented people become aware that being a compliance officer is actually a really skilled professional role. And that is why the qualifications that we do offer do focus on developing you as professionals not on teaching you about the current regulations and legislations. That is clearly part of what we do, but the focus is on developing you. Okay, few key hot topics that are currently sort of engaging with us. It's important to talk about hot topics now because the workshops, when you're doing any of our courses from the advanced certificate and above, the workshops, as Becca alluded to earlier, are without a doubt the most enjoyable and probably the most useful in terms of learning element of the course. You get to interact with 25 peers, usually from across different industries, certainly from within different types of organisation within your industry. And within those workshops, what we are doing is we're taking the learning from the materials, which is already up to date because it's updated every year, but then bringing it up to date in terms of what's happening now and what's happening going forward. When I'm asked quite often what's the difference between a compliance officer and an auditor, one of the answers there is very clearly that auditors tend to look at what you're doing now and what you've done in the past, whereas compliance professionals must be looking at what you're doing now, of course, but a lot of the focus is what's coming, what's in the future, because it's managing that risk that's coming up. So in the workshops, we say, so what's happening now? What's keeping you awake at night? Hence, starting with a slide on Brexit. The implications of Brexit have been, in the short term, maybe some tightening of training budgets. So well done for all of you who have convinced your businesses to pay for one of our qualifications. But what it will definitely do is increase the amount of regulatory change and development in the next 5 years. So some of the current hot topics include the power/independence of the regulator. Would you be surprised if I said to you, I think the FCA has been told to get back in its box over the last 12 months? There has been definite pressure, political pressure, which led to Martin Wheatley leaving, Tracy McDermott deciding not to take the role in the end. And we've had probably the first year I can ever remember where the regulator has been quieter over the last 12 months than they were the previous 12 months. Now, that's dangerous for us because the regulation hasn't changed, the requirement to be compliant hasn't changed, but I know some of your senior managers might be taking their eye off the regulatory ball a little bit because things have gone a bit quieter, because they might even be aware that there's political pressure on our lead regulators. Now is probably a more dangerous time than ever, and your job is to make sure your firms know that. In fact, on the economic cycle, as you come out of recession and firms start to grow and everything begins to look rosy, the risk of regulatory issues increases because the pressure, commercial pressures increase. So again, you might find that you're not given quite the voice you were given during harder times, when there were scandals, when you were in a recession, and yet the risk of regulatory issues actually goes up. Of course, the Brexit vote's thrown that into complete confusion, because instead of the expected growth, we now assume there might be another recession, but we don't know. And part of what we do in compliance is trying to understand and second guess to a degree what might be coming. So we look back, we look at where we are, we try and work out what's coming up. Another key area is the focus on the senior management themselves, making sure individuals are held to account for their decisions. Those of you in financial services will be fully aware of the senior management and certification regime. But we've had the approved person regime for 16 years. All it is a development and an enhancement upon it. And we knew it was coming. It should not have been a surprise or even that difficult for firms to comply if they were planning ahead, knew what was coming, put their plans in place, educated their businesses. The real test is yet to come anyway. A lot of firms might think, particularly your senior managers might think, oh good, the senior management regime, that's done now, that's in, I've had my training, we can move on to the next thing. Whereas those of us in compliance know thematic review coming up in about 6 months' time, because it always happens. New regulatory change, give it a year, then check on how effective it is. Using your judgment for decision making. Do you think anybody makes a bad decision on purpose? But if you can't prove why you've made your decision, and the decision turns out to be wrong, you will be held to account for it. If your decision turns out to be wrong, but the rationale was fine, and you documented it, and you can evidence it, then okay, you might get some grief for your colleagues for a poor decision, but you've met your regulatory requirements in showing it was a judgment-based decision. But does the rest of your business know this? We have just launched a specialist certificate in managing conduct risk. Do you think we would have done that if the regulator wasn't going on and on and on about conduct? We're reflecting the regulator's needs. Conduct has always been there as a risk. Treating your customers fairly, going back 10, 15 years, was one of the FSA's old projects. Now it's known as the conduct agenda. It's an evolving process, and it will continue to evolve. And it's not just your customers either. Don't forget market conduct. How are you behaving with the markets? What's your disclosure like? How honest and truthful are you being, Sainsbury's? These kind of things. You're all aware that 3 directors got arrested last week, Friday afternoon, for their piece in misleading the markets. And then finally, one of my favourite topics, remuneration. How do we get rewarded for what we do? Should we be rewarded commercially? How do we make sure that traders, salespeople, demonstrate the right kind of behaviours? Remuneration is critical because, again, in the workshops, we'll look into this in more depth, but why does anybody do anything? Are we all just doing this because we think it's the right thing to do for humankind? It's our jobs. Hopefully we enjoy it and we're in the career that suits us, but we need to be rewarded for it, and remuneration changes our behaviour. And therefore it's a key tool in changing the behaviour in your organisations. Okay, the key areas of focus on the course itself. What does the syllabus look like? Understanding the big picture, the full regulatory environment. The key influencer in the UK on financial services is the media. It's not the government, it's not the regulator, it's the media. Anybody want to argue with me? Perhaps not now, but we have those debates in the workshops. We also then say, so what is effective governance, risk and compliance? And how does it support the success of the business? One very simple example would be if I were to talk about corporate governance. The purpose of corporate governance is one thing and one thing only: to improve decision-making in your business. Now, is your business going to be more successful if it improves its decision-making? If it makes less wrong decisions? If it understands why it made good decisions? Of course it is. Good governance equals good business in a way which is undeniable. How you use your resources, we examine the role of compliance, the activities that need to be carried out, which ones carry the greatest benefits, where should you focus your resources and why. By the way, why is my favourite word in the world. And on all of the courses that we run, the key word in workshops, in exam questions, in any sort of webinar, any answer anybody gives me, my response will be, interesting answer, why? It's the why that demonstrates your understanding, and from an ICA assessment point of view, that gets you the good marks. There's a little tip. Implementing effective governance is all well and good, writing controls, understanding the environment, making sure that what you've done is right. How do you get people to actually do what you've asked them to do, willingly see the benefits of it, and embed compliance into the business? The compliance function is not responsible for the firm's compliance. Every individual in the business is responsible for the firm's compliance. How do you get them to take that responsibility on board? Because they won't want it unless you can show them a benefit for doing it. And then for yourself, individually, a lot of the key skills required by a modern compliance professional are soft skills. Having the technical knowledge, the understanding of the regulatory environment and the legislation regulation has to almost be a given. To be an effective compliance officer, you've got to understand people. Why is that director behaving in that way? Why is that salesperson saying this to me? And therefore, communication skills are critical. Understanding what people want from you and then being able to demonstrate what you can give to them in return. Absolutely critical. So we look at the skills and we look at your individual skills and how you can maximize and build upon your strengths and how you can potentially then develop your development areas, your weaknesses, if you like. You're not supposed to say weaknesses, are you? Rubbish. Maximize your strengths, address your weaknesses. And then finally, The whole course, we try and make sure is as practical and pragmatic and relevant as possible. As well as dealing with what's going on today and what's coming in the future, we look at what's going on in your firms and say, right, well, how can you improve that? What next action could you take next week to see improvements in that area? Quite often the assignments are written in such a way that you can use the assignment to actually bring around change in your firm. From what you learn writing that assignment, you can then go back to the business and create change that we will see direct improvements. So if any of you are struggling to get your firm to pay for these courses, they will pay for themselves so quickly in terms of what you learn and what you bring back to the business. Okay, so which qualifications should you do? I've got the full range of qualifications here, and as Phil said earlier, it's very difficult as a group to say which is the right one for you. Certification is entry, it's understanding what is compliance, what's the regulatory environment look like, what do I need to know, how can I manage regulatory compliance in my business. The advanced certificate level is very much about being a practitioner. What should I be doing on a day-to-day basis? If you already work in compliance, chances are the certificate level is probably not for you because you already have some understanding, and so you'd be looking at the advanced certificate or the diploma. The diploma is about managing governance, risk and compliance. So it's more about if you have responsibility for others or you're trying to communicate and push compliance out into the business, beginning to show the benefits, the rationale for what you're doing. And then the postgraduate is for leaders, for people with 10 years experience, 3 at a senior level, right at the cutting edge of trying to make compliance a real contributor to the strategic success of your business. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of understanding, and you can see we have 3 different areas at the advanced certificate level. And again, I can only really recommend you look at the syllabus. Look at the topics covered to determine which is the correct one for you. I had a queue of people waiting for me at the last break. No doubt I'll have a queue of people waiting for me at the next break. But ask me if you're stuck at all. You can also, if you don't get to speak to any of us today, come through on the via email or via the telephones to ICT at any time. We will guide you in the right direction. But at the end of the day, it has to be your decision. Okay? But we'll try and put you in the right place. Okay. This is an example of those assignments. So in the same way that Lee gave you an example of a case where Mr. E sneakily controlled 40% of his business, we might set you an exercise or even develop it into an assignment to say, you now have a free hand to design your own compliance function. How would you structure it? And why would you structure it in that way? What type of roles would you have? What kind of responsibilities? What kind of resources do you need to develop this compliance function to manage your firm's regulatory risk? And we would normally actually do this as a group exercise and perhaps have 4 or 5 answers to it, which we would then compare in the room. And we'd look at for similarities and differences in approach. And by the end of the exercise, you're going away with new ideas. How could we structure things differently? And my challenge with this exercise is also, you should be doing this as part of your day job anyway. If you're running a compliance function, at least once a year, sit down, blank sheet of paper, design your perfect compliance function, and then compare it to what you've already got. And if they're not the same, you've got a job to do. So hopefully this sort of shows how practical and pragmatic the course can be as well, to bring all these things together. Okay. A couple of nice quotes on there, which we didn't have to pay any money for. They are genuine, although not attributed. The people who do our courses, the best source of new delegates is by recommendation. I'm sure a lot of you are here today because people have suggested you come along and find out more. So please do talk to previous delegates as much as you can. And then finally, the governance, risk and compliance team is me and my colleague Rod, who is currently teaching today because we have a very busy day. So unfortunately, I am the only GRC person here today. I will do my best to try and speak to everybody. But as I say, I'm more than happy to pick up after the after today's session as well by telephone or email or however you want to speak to.